Just 1 week ago, I nearly lost my life in the ICU. Every breath burned my chest, while my daughter-in-law stood at my bedside, her lips stretched in a fake smile for the doctor. Yet under the blanket, her hand crushed mine as if she wanted to choke the last breath from me. I saw the cruelty in her eyes when she hissed, "Worthless old hag, you would not understand." I could not shout. I whispered into the tube, "No, but the FBI will. To know why I am still here to tell this, stay with me. Like, share, and leave a comment to tell me where you are listening from, and I promise what I reveal will satisfy you." 1 month ago, I sat alone in the study, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the Miami sun, and let the silence remind me of everything that was mine. The Bennett fashion empire was not just another luxury brand, but a dynasty built on decades of strategy, sacrifice, and vision. Across Europe and New York, our boutiques sparkled like jewels on the finest streets, and every season the world waited for our collections to appear, a testament to discipline and daring. My shares, carefully held and never diluted, gave me the decisive voice, the vote that could shape or shatter any proposal, and I knew that without me, no deal could ever stand. That was my power, my shield, my legacy, and even in moments of grief, I guarded it as fiercely as breath itself. The Miami mansion, with its grand staircases and marble floors, was more than a residence. It was heritage, a protected landmark that no greedy hand could pawn off or use as collateral. The state itself had recognized its cultural weight, and every visitor who walked those echoing halls felt the weight of history pressing gently on their shoulders. I often wandered down the corridor lined with carved oak panels, running my fingertips along the worn grain, and I swore I could almost hear whispers from the generations who had passed before me. The house was not only stone and wood, it was memory turned into architecture, a fortress disguised as home. Then there was the art, my fortress within a fortress, $340 million in paintings and sculptures, every piece registered, insured, and catalogued, each with its own international code. I remembered standing in Madrid at the Prado, gazing at a canvas almost twin to one of mine, and realizing that my private gallery could rival the museums of the world. No thief could dream of stealing it, for the paper trail was as ironclad as the vaults that guarded the works. Every brushstroke was accounted for, every sculpture traced through centuries of provenance. My late husband had left nothing to chance. His will was a blade written in ink, sharp and undeniable. I was the principal heir, entrusted with all, until the last day of my life. Only Caleb, our only son, was named after me, the eventual successor, the one who would step into his inheritance only when my breath was gone. And so it was written, and so it would stand. My daughter-in-law, Ella, no matter how sweet her smiles or how elaborate her manipulations, was an outsider. She was dressed in silk and draped in ambition, but in the eyes of the law she was nothing more than a guest, bound by courtesy but never by right. She had no claim, no authority, no standing, and if she dreamed otherwise, those dreams were as empty as the promises she whispered. Still, as I sat beneath the lamplight, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers and oil portraits staring down at me, I reminded myself of a hard truth. Safeguards may be written, wills may be notarized, assets may be insured and registered, but snakes find cracks, and shadows creep even into fortresses. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, and vowed that I would not be caught unaware. The first thing I remember was the blinding white light of the ICU and the mechanical rhythm of the monitor marking each fragile beat of my heart. My body felt like stone, heavy and unyielding, yet every breath burned as if air itself had turned against me. The doctors whispered about a myocardial infarction, their voices hushed but firm, and I caught enough to know that my condition demanded strict supervision, medication, and silence. I had never been silent in my life, never surrendered authority, yet now I lay in a hospital bed, my chest bound with invisible chains, while others moved papers and pens in my name. It was Ella who stepped forward to sign the admission documents, her elegant hand gliding over the forms, her voice steady as she assumed temporary medical power of attorney. I wanted to protest, to lift my hand and scrawl my own name, but weakness held me down. She smiled at me when the doctor looked her way, but beneath the cover of the blanket I felt her fingers press into mine, not with comfort, but with a cruel reminder that she now held the pen. Days blurred into one another, punctuated by the clatter of carts and the beeping of machines, and at first I trusted the ritual of pills handed to me in small cups. But then the dizziness began, strange waves that clouded my vision, that left me struggling to steady myself even as I lay motionless. I had known medications long enough to sense when something was off. The dosage did not match my memory. The aftertaste carried a bitterness that was not supposed to be there. Yet the attending physician saw only the neat chart, the records already altered to match a false prescription. His trust in the papers was absolute, and my protests were dismissed as weakness, as confusion born of age and trauma. Each visitor who came looked at me with pity, some with tears brimming in their eyes, others whispering in corners as if I were already fading into history. They spoke in tones of sorrow, their gazes sliding toward Ella as though she were already assuming my place. I heard them murmur that I might never recover, that the empire, the art, the estate, all would soon be divided. In their minds I was finished, my voice extinguished, my power gone. And perhaps that was exactly what Ella wanted them to believe. Lying there with tubes and wires binding me, I clenched what little strength I had and told myself that appearances could deceive, that this frail body still housed a will sharper than any blade. Caleb was thousands of miles away when the storm first struck, sitting in a glass tower in Milan, where contracts and deadlines consumed every waking hour. As CEO, his days blurred into negotiations with European partners, dinners with investors, endless meetings where every word could alter the future of the Bennett empire. I knew the pressure he carried on his shoulders, the weight of keeping the company's reputation flawless in markets where one mistake meant millions lost. So when the crisis of my heart landed me in the ICU, he could not simply abandon his seat at the table. Instead, bound by duty and urgency, he sent his trust home, placing it into the hands of the one person he believed would protect me as fiercely as he would. That faith was his blind spot, and Ella knew it. His email arrived like a knife cloaked in tenderness. In it, he wrote that he wished he could be with me, that every thought of his was torn between Milan and Miami, and then the words that gave her everything slipped across the screen. Let her handle everything for you and for the company until I return. To him it was reassurance, a husband delegating with love. But to me, if I had read it then, it would have been the sound of a door unlocking. With those lines, he unknowingly placed the keys of both family and fortune into her hands. What Caleb never saw was how easily Ella intercepted my words. Each email I typed with trembling fingers, each message I dictated with fading breath, never reached him. She had arranged it long before, threads of control woven through the systems, loyal hands in the shadows who filtered what passed between mother and son. My pleas for him to question the medications, my warnings about her sudden grasp on medical authority, all of it vanished into silence. To him, I was simply quiet, perhaps too weak to write, perhaps resting as she reported, and so his trust grew deeper while my voice dissolved into nothing. I lay in the hospital bed listening to the echo of that silence. The boy I had raised into a man of discipline and strength now stood blind, oceans away, convinced his wife was my guardian. He could not know that each decision she made in my name tightened her hold on both my body and his empire. I closed my eyes and felt a cold determination harden in me. She thought distance and deceit would keep him in her orbit, but I had survived too long, fought too many wars, to let silence be my end. Ella perfected her performance so completely that even I, lying in the ICU with wires binding me, sometimes had to remind myself that what others saw was nothing but a carefully staged play. In front of the doctors, she floated like an angel, her soft voice dripping with kindness as she asked about my medication, her hands adjusting my blanket as if I were her beloved mother. I once watched her snap a photo by my bedside, angling it just right. Then moments later I heard the faint buzz of her phone as she uploaded it to social media with a caption about caring for her dearest family. Nurses whispered about her devotion, the younger ones even sighing that I was lucky to have such a daughter-in-law. I bit down on my breath, tasting the bitterness of silence, because I alone knew that behind her smile lived a predator who waited for every chance to tighten her grip. At the company, she played yet another role. Caleb's absence gave her the stage she craved. She sat at the head of the table during meetings, her eyes shining with borrowed authority, introducing herself as acting vice president on behalf of her husband. Staff, uncertain and respectful, nodded along, some even whispering admiration at her confidence. She was building her narrative step by step, making sure that when the story of my decline spread, she would be standing at the center as the natural heir of influence. They could not see the strings, they only saw the performance, and applause came too easily to those who never knew the truth. At home, she discarded the veil of gentleness entirely. The house that had stood for generations now moved to her commands. She opened safes without hesitation, rifled through legal documents, called in the notary with a tone of authority, and dismissed servants as though she had been born mistress of the estate. I heard from whispers of the staff that she ordered the security guards directly, changing shifts, rearranging duties, ensuring her eyes and ears were everywhere. The walls of my own home no longer belonged to me, and I lay trapped while she strutted through the corridors as though destiny had crowned her. But when the curtains closed, when no one else remained in the room but the two of us, her mask dropped like glass shattering on marble. Her eyes turned hard, her smile disappeared, and her words sliced through the quiet with the sharpness of a blade. She leaned close to my ear, her breath cold, and told me I was finished, that she would make sure Caleb never doubted her, that the world already believed she was the daughter I never had. In those moments, the illusion died, leaving me face to face with her true nature. I felt my heart strain, but at the same time a new fire sparked in me, because knowing the face of the enemy is the first step in preparing for war. There were nights when I lay awake in the mansion, listening for the soft chime of the front gate, and I would hear it long past midnight. Moments later came the sound of her heels striking the marble floor, and then the faintest trace of perfume drifted through the corridors, never the scent she wore in the daylight, always something sharper, exotic, too bold to be coincidence. I saw her once in the dim reflection of the hallway mirror, her hair slightly disheveled, lipstick smudged, eyes darting with the quickness of someone who carried secrets. But secrets without proof remain shadows, and shadows cannot be shown to a sun blinded by love. Whenever I attempted even the gentlest suggestion, Caleb's face hardened. He would take her hand, his jaw tight, and tell me I was imagining things. He said stress and age were twisting my thoughts, that his wife was devoted beyond measure, that I should be grateful for her loyalty. Each word from him was a wall, shutting me out of the truth I longed for him to see. I swallowed my protests, for I feared that pushing harder would only drive him further into her embrace, and I could not bear the thought of my own words tearing apart what was left of our family. Ella's craft was impeccable. She knew how to weave her image with threads no one dared to question. She arrived at the hospital bearing expensive chocolates and gift cards, her smile lighting the faces of nurses and doctors, leaving them convinced she was a saint of kindness. At school, she was always the mother with perfect hair, a radiant presence who made teachers sing her praises. She left no angle uncovered, no opportunity wasted, creating a portrait so flawless that anyone who looked would see only devotion, generosity, and charm. Yet I knew better. I saw the cracks she tried so carefully to seal, the fleeting glances, the scent that lingered too long, the way her eyes sharpened whenever Caleb's back was turned. Still, what could I do with suspicion alone? The cost of truth was too heavy, for it would not only wound my son but perhaps shatter the very foundation of his life. And so I lived with silence, carrying the bitter knowledge like a stone pressed into my chest. I waited, helpless yet watchful, certain that one day her mask would slip, and when it did, I vowed I would be ready. It was only much later, when fragments of truth began to surface like shards of broken glass, that I uncovered the scale of Ella's betrayals. The whispers I had once dismissed as paranoia crystallized into a picture so monstrous I could hardly breathe. She was not entangled with one lover, but with many, each man chosen for power, position, or profit. The first name that struck me with horror was Liam Brooks, director of the city's most prestigious museum, a man the world hailed as a guardian of culture. Yet in reality, he was nothing more than a polished thief cloaked in respectability. Liam had devised a scheme as elegant as it was poisonous. Through the museum, he drafted contracts that appeared genuine, agreements with international institutions for temporary exhibitions. These documents stated that certain works from my collection would be on loan for 6 months, catalogued and transported under the guise of cultural exchange. On paper, everything glowed with legitimacy. Curators signed, stamps were affixed, and no one questioned why masterpieces left my home. But what truly departed was not destined for public halls or curated displays. They were smuggled through the back corridors of art fairs and private auctions, slipping into the hands of shadowed buyers willing to pay fortunes for treasures they believed untouchable. The deception ran deeper still. Within the global art registry, Liam created duplicate entries, fabricating shadow files that mirrored each original piece. These forgeries were so meticulously prepared that unless one compared hidden serials or examined the microdot markers embedded for insurance purposes, the theft could never be detected. To any casual observer, to any diligent registrar, the paintings still existed exactly where they were supposed to be. My walls looked bare, but the paperwork said otherwise, and in this illusion Ella found her freedom to betray me without fear. Her promise to Liam was the lifeblood of his ambition. She whispered of secret auctions, of hidden funds she would channel as if conjured from thin air, tens of millions that would flow into his museum. With such rivers of money he would rise, his name etched among the greatest patrons of culture, his career ascending on the wings of her deceit. He gave her the perfect mask of respectability, and she gave him the riches he craved. The cruelest twist was his cunning gesture to maintain trust. In the museum's VIP room, away from the eyes of the public, he hung several of my authentic paintings. Only the wealthy elite were invited to view them, sipping wine and murmuring admiration, convinced that these treasures rested safe within the institution. They did not know that those very works had already been quietly sold to foreign collectors, laundered through the labyrinth of secrecy that Ella and Liam had built together. Each false smile, each elegant soiree was a cover for a theft of staggering proportions. Noah Harrison had once been a name I trusted without hesitation, a man who had dined at my table, held my husband's hand during negotiations, and whispered legal strategies that had shielded our empire for decades. Yet betrayal often wears the face of loyalty until the mask cracks, and Noah's mask shattered when I learned of his entanglement with Ella. As the family's attorney, he had memorized every clause of the will, every codicil and trust, every line that defined where the empire would flow. That knowledge, which should have been my safeguard, became his weapon. He used it not to protect me, but to carve loopholes wide enough for Ella to slip through, giving her a power she could never have claimed on her own. It began with forged authority. Together they crafted a false power of attorney, a paper so polished, so officially notarized, that even seasoned bankers accepted it without a blink. It gave her the right to sign in my stead, to authorize transactions as though my hand had guided the pen. I had spent a lifetime ensuring my assets were fortified, but one piece of paper, dripping with counterfeit legitimacy, allowed her to breach defenses I once believed unbreakable. My name, my legacy, became a puppet's mask she wore with ease, and each signature she scrawled was another theft of my voice. Noah's cunning ran deeper than forged signatures. He built labyrinths of shell companies across the Caymans and the British Virgin Islands, cloaking transactions in layers so dense that even a determined investigator would struggle to pierce them. Assets that once bore the Bennett name were quietly transferred into anonymous entities, shuffled through directors and shareholders whose identities were as hollow as the corporations themselves. I pictured him in dimly lit offices, drawing diagrams of ownership, moving pieces across the board until no one could tell where the money began or where it ended. To the outside world, everything looked ordinary, perhaps even routine. Yet beneath the surface lay a grand theft executed with surgical precision. He promised her invincibility. I can almost hear his voice, smooth as silk, assuring her that as long as documents carried a signature and a notary's seal, no court would ever challenge them. He told her the law was a fortress built of paper, and she held the master key. That assurance gave her the confidence to stride into banks, to summon accountants, to order transfers with the poise of someone born to authority. She believed herself untouchable, and Noah fed that illusion, all while lining his own pockets with the spoils of deceit. And I, lying silent in the hospital bed, realized that the man I had once trusted with my fortune had sold me for ambition, binding himself not to justice or loyalty, but to the deceitful embrace of my son's wife. Ella's third affair was with Logan Price, the deputy director of the company and my son's most trusted aide, a man she ensnared with both desire and ambition. Logan Price had always stood in the shadow of my son, a man who wore the title of deputy with quiet resentment, waiting for the day he could claim the throne for himself. He had been Caleb's right hand for years, the one who drafted reports, managed negotiations, and carried out orders without hesitation. But loyalty can be poisoned when ambition whispers louder, and Ella knew exactly how to turn his hunger into betrayal. She dangled promises before him like bait, whispering that once I was gone and she secured her hold on the company, he would no longer be the second man in command, but the one seated at the very top as CEO. For Logan, it was the dream he had never admitted aloud, and the temptation proved too strong. Behind the polished doors of the corporate offices, he began to sabotage the very foundation he was meant to protect. Sensitive details about contracts with European partners leaked into the wrong hands, whispers of discrepancies that made foreign investors uneasy. Meetings that should have ended with signatures instead ended with delays, with questions, with suspicion that grew like a shadow over the boardroom. Caleb, working tirelessly in Milan, felt the weight of resistance without ever realizing that the source of doubt had been planted by his own deputy. At the same time, Logan crafted reports so carefully distorted that they seemed flawless. Every spreadsheet that landed in Caleb's inbox painted a picture of stability back home, assuring him that the American branches of the empire thrived without issue. It gave Caleb false confidence, allowing him to focus abroad while the walls of his kingdom quietly cracked beneath him. I could almost picture Logan at his desk, adjusting figures with a steady hand, feeding Ella's schemes while pretending to serve my son with loyalty. In return, she promised him riches beyond his station. 20% of the company's shares, a prize large enough to turn him from servant to master, dangled before his eyes like a golden crown. He believed her, perhaps even adored her, thinking himself chosen, thinking himself destined to rise. And Ella, with her venomous charm, let him drink deeply from the chalice of ambition. But I, watching from the silence of my confinement, saw the truth that none of them could. Logan was not a king but a pawn, willing to burn bridges and betray a family for promises carved in smoke. And though he thought he was climbing toward power, he was only digging deeper into the pit Ella had prepared for them all. Recovery was supposed to be my horizon, the point where the storm had passed and healing began, yet each morning brought waves of weakness I could not explain. My blood pressure dipped without reason, leaving me dizzy and trembling, as though the floor beneath me shifted even while I lay still. I had survived the danger of a heart attack, endured the invasive tubes and wires, and the doctors assured me the worst was behind me. But the betrayal of my own body told another story, one that gnawed at me with a terror deeper than illness itself. I began to watch more closely, noting the rhythm of pills placed in the small plastic cup by my bedside. There were whites, yellows, and then one day a single blue tablet nestled among them like an intruder. My eyes lingered on it, my instincts prickling, because in all the explanations my physician had offered, no mention of such a pill had ever been made. I asked the nurse with as much calm as I could muster, and I saw her falter. Her hands shifted, her gaze avoided mine, and she mumbled something about adjustments from the attending doctor. But I had been in hospitals too long to mistake hesitation for truth. I demanded to see the medication chart, to compare it against the prescriptions I knew had been filed. What I found made my heart constrict more than any spasm of pain could. Several entries were altered, signatures misaligned, doses mismatched. The chart before me did not mirror the records I had overheard my physician dictate only days earlier. It was as though invisible hands had reached into the files, twisting them until falsehood wore the mask of authority. The nurses, young and fearful, avoided my eyes. Their silence was not ignorance, it was fear. I realized that some higher hand had manipulated not only the documents, but also the staff, turning them into unwilling accomplices. And then my gaze fell again on the blue pill, glinting in the light, a silent symbol of betrayal. This was no mistake, no clerical error, no benign confusion. Someone had tampered with my treatment, altering the very course of medicine meant to sustain me. A chill spread through me as I closed my hand around the cup, not swallowing, only pretending. I could almost hear the laughter behind the curtain of deception, the certainty of those who thought I was too weak, too frail to notice. But I did notice, and with that realization came the spark of fury that pushed blood back through my veins. If they wanted me silent, they had underestimated me gravely. I would bide my time, gather what strength remained, and uncover the hand that sought to hasten my death. It was during one of those weary afternoons in the ICU, when the beeping of machines blended with the sterile hum of the air conditioner, that a familiar face appeared at the door. It was Martin, our butler, who had served this family for more than 20 years, a man whose loyalty had never wavered, even as others bowed to power or temptation. He entered carrying a basket of fruit wrapped neatly in cellophane, his posture respectful, his eyes darting carefully toward the nurses before approaching my bed. He leaned close, arranging the apples and pears as though his only concern was comfort, but his whisper reached my ear with the weight of a hammer. "Madam, some of the paintings are missing from the storage." For a moment I froze, my breath shallow because those words cut deeper than any diagnosis. Martin knew the vault better than anyone, knew the precise order of the canvases, the way each crate was labeled and sealed. He had been the guardian of that wing for decades, and if he said something was gone, it meant theft had already breached my walls. I kept my expression still, for the nurse was glancing over, but inside my mind raced, tracing the chain of betrayals back to the same poisonous root. He continued in a voice just above a breath, telling me of nights when strange cars rolled through the gates, engines low, headlights dimmed. Men in dark suits entered and left without a word to the staff, their movements hurried, secretive. They carried cases, sometimes crates, and though he strained to catch a glimpse, he dared not confront them. No logs were kept, no names recorded, as though the estate had become a harbor for ghosts. He suspected permission had been granted from inside, someone with authority powerful enough to override standard security. But suspicion was as dangerous as knowledge, and Martin's eyes carried the fear of a man who knew speaking too loudly could cost him his life. I placed my hand gently over his as he adjusted the basket, a silent gesture of gratitude. In his tremor I felt his courage, thin but unbroken. He was risking much to warn me, using the guise of fruit and flowers to smuggle truth into the sterile prison of my room. The revelation churned inside me, proof that the conspiracy stretched beyond forged documents and poisoned pills. My treasures were already vanishing into the night, aided by accomplices who wore trust like a cloak. I bit back the urge to weep, for Martin's devotion deserved strength, not weakness. When he left, bowing his head with the same deference he had shown since the day he entered my service, I lay back and let his words replay again and again. The theft was not a rumor, not a suspicion, but a reality clawing at the very marrow of my legacy. Yet even in despair, a seed of resolve took root. As long as loyal eyes still watched from the shadows, I would not be blind, and as long as loyalty still whispered truth, I would not be alone. Ella never missed her cues, and in front of the doctors she was the very picture of a grieving angel. She clasped my hand in hers, squeezing gently as if our bond was sacred, her eyes glistening with tears that slid down her cheeks whenever the conversation turned to my fragile health. I watched her perform, her voice quivering with practiced sorrow as she told the physicians how deeply she feared for me, how she lay awake every night wondering if I would survive another sunrise. Nurses murmured about her devotion, their sympathy clouding their judgment, and I lay there, silent, knowing that every tear was false, every tremor rehearsed. It was she who pressed the attending physician for an extension of my ICU stay. With a soft, trembling voice, she pleaded that I was still too weak, that the risks of sending me home could be fatal. She begged for one more week, another round of monitoring, disguising her calculation as concern. The chief doctor, faced with a daughter-in-law so earnest, so insistent on safeguarding her mother, nodded reluctantly and agreed. I wanted to scream, to tell him that I was stronger now, that my place was not among wires and machines but back in my home, where I might at least defend myself. Yet my words carried no weight beside her performance, her mask of saintly worry more persuasive than the truth of my voice. When I demanded discharge, she revealed her sharpest weapon. With perfect timing, she produced the document Caleb had signed before his trip, a temporary medical power of attorney, his trust written in ink that now shackled me. She presented it with quiet authority, her eyes glistening with false regret as she explained that her husband had entrusted her with decisions for my well-being. The doctor hesitated, then looked at the seal, the signature, the notary's stamp, and all his doubts faded. The law had spoken, and in its letter she had found her fortress. I was trapped, my protests muted by the weight of a paper I had never wanted, never consented to. The truth lay far darker than the doctor could imagine. This was not about safety, not about healing, but about control. The ICU was her fortress, the sterile walls her weapon, the restricted access her shield. Here she could oversee every pill, every chart, every nurse who stepped into my room. Here she could filter visitors, preventing loyal eyes from reaching me, keeping my allies at bay while she tightened her hold. Each day in that bed was another strand of her web, binding me tighter, making me appear too frail to resist, too dependent to fight. But within me, fury grew in silence, because I knew her cage was not unbreakable, and one day her own lies would tear it apart. From the distance of my hospital bed, I could sense Ella's hand stretching far beyond the sterile walls of the ICU, weaving threads of manipulation that reached all the way to Milan. She told everyone that she was sending 2 young secretaries overseas to assist Caleb with diplomatic meetings, a gesture that seemed dutiful and supportive. On paper, it was the act of a devoted wife helping her husband shoulder the immense burden of European negotiations. But beneath that polished explanation was the same venom that had seeped into every corner of her schemes. The 2 secretaries were not chosen for their skills or their loyalty to the company. They were chosen for their beauty, their charm, their ability to cloud a man's focus with smiles and subtle glances. Ella arranged for them to stay in the same district as Caleb, their hotel just a stone's throw from his, making their presence unavoidable. Invitations soon followed, casual dinners that turned into late-night drinks, excuses of celebration after tense meetings. Caleb, weary from constant negotiations, saw them as harmless company, a reminder of youth and energy in the midst of stress. He did not know that every laugh, every toast, every casual touch was being catalogued in secret. One of the young women, clever and cold beneath her smile, began to capture moments with her phone. A hand brushing across his arm, a laugh too close, a glass of wine tilted toward his lips. None of it was betrayal, not in truth, yet in photographs stripped of context, it could be painted as damning. Those images, carefully selected, made their way back across the ocean to Ella, who stored them like weapons in a hidden arsenal. She was building her case long before any courtroom existed, preparing to brand him unfaithful, reckless, undeserving. Should she ever decide to sever the marriage publicly, she would not leave as a wife betrayed, but as a victim vindicated, claiming sympathy and wealth in the same breath. But her plan reached even deeper. By surrounding Caleb with distractions, by filling his evenings with charm and temptation, she weakened his vigilance. He was less likely to question the flow of reports from home, less likely to sense the irregularities in contracts, less likely to notice the silence in my messages. Milan became not only his workplace but his prison, gilded with smiles, bound by illusions. He thought he was managing his duties while unwinding with harmless company, yet in truth every step had been staged to blind him. Lying in my hospital bed, I pieced these fragments together through whispers and instinct, and I felt both sorrow and fury. Ella was not merely attacking me, she was dismantling my son's world piece by piece, clouding his mind until he could not see the storm gathering at home. The crisis began like a hairline crack in glass, almost invisible at first, then spreading quickly until the entire surface threatened to shatter. Logan Price, the deputy director who wore loyalty like a mask, had deliberately tampered with the numbers in the expense reports. Small discrepancies at first, but enough to raise the eyebrows of the European partners seated across polished tables in Milan. They questioned the competence of the Bennett Company, whispered to one another about oversight and negligence, and soon suspicion poisoned the very air in the boardroom. Caleb defended the figures, his voice steady, but the documents in his hands had been doctored by the man standing just a few feet away, the very one he trusted to support him. As if that was not enough, another blow struck. Containers filled with imported fabrics, the lifeblood of the next season's collection, were detained at the port. Customs officials cited missing paperwork, authorizations that had never been filed, and signatures that should have been there but were absent. The truth was not incompetence, but sabotage. Logan had forgotten to sign an entire batch of documents, a mistake too glaring to be accidental. Now the materials sat in warehouses by the docks, gathering dust while deadlines crept closer. The partners in Europe heard of this, and their doubts deepened, their questions sharpened into accusations. Caleb, caught between fraying trust abroad and a collapsing supply chain at home, had no choice but to remain. If he left now, if he abandoned negotiations, the contracts worth hundreds of millions would dissolve into smoke. The company's reputation, once burnished with decades of reliability, would be stained beyond repair. He worked long hours, chasing answers that never fit, patching holes that only widened, while Logan whispered reassurances in one ear and quietly fed Ella updates through another channel. I later learned of one such message, a simple sentence delivered across oceans like the tolling of a bell. He is trapped here. No chance to return in time to interfere. With those words, Ella's control tightened, her plan clicking neatly into place. My son was stranded by duty, bound to the mess his deputy had created, while I lay in Miami surrounded by wires and deceit. The ocean between us had never felt wider, and the silence in his absence pressed on me like a weight. Yet even then, I felt the faint stirrings of resolve. For if Ella believed distance would silence me, she had underestimated both a mother's will and the power of truth waiting to be unearthed. The day I finally signed the papers to leave the hospital felt like tearing through a veil of suffocation. I insisted on a private medical team, arranged under my name, their loyalty secured with contracts and pay that Ella could not tamper with. They wheeled me back into the estate with quiet efficiency, the air of my home rushing over me like a forgotten hymn. Yet the relief of returning did not last long. As the attendants guided me into the grand living room, my eyes fell instantly upon a canvas that hung above the mantelpiece, a painting I had studied countless times with my late husband. And in that first glance, I knew something was wrong. It was subtle, almost invisible to an untrained eye. Ella, standing nearby with her mask of concern, smiled faintly and told me it was only the light, that the sun's angle through the curtains made the colors shift. But her words rang hollow, because I remembered every inch of that painting as one remembers a child's face. In the lower corner, there had once been a hairline crack, delicate yet distinct, a mark my husband and I had once traced with our fingers like a secret no one else could see. That scar of time was gone, erased as though it had never existed. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening while Ella's eyes watched me too closely. She laughed softly, repeating that the canvas was the same, only the room was different, but her voice trembled at the edges. In that moment I felt a cold certainty coil inside me. What hung before me was no masterpiece, only a double. The original had been stolen, its ghost left behind to deceive guests and perhaps even me, had I not known it so well. But I was not without weapons of my own. Years ago, after a near theft in Paris, my husband and I had taken precautions. Each of the rarest works was fitted with a microchip hidden deep within the wooden frame, invisible to the naked eye, detectable only with the handheld scanner we kept locked in my study. As soon as the attendant settled me into the chair, I asked for the scanner, my request so calm that Ella could not refuse. When I passed it along the edge of the frame, no signal returned. The machine remained silent, confirming what my heart already knew. The true painting was gone, smuggled out under the guise of safety and routine, replaced with a flawless forgery dot. It was midday, the sun pouring through the curtains in long golden stripes, and the house had fallen into its usual hush. I lay in my bed, eyes closed, body still, pretending to drift in sleep, while the steady rhythm of my own breath disguised the storm inside me. That was when I heard it. Ella's voice, sharp as glass, slicing through the silence from just beyond the doorway. She thought me unconscious, thought her mask of sweetness could rest for a moment, and what spilled from her lips was colder than ice itself. If she lives a few more months, all of our plans will collapse. The words came fast, hushed but merciless, yet every syllable fell into my ears with the weight of iron. A chill swept through me, deeper than any fever, deeper than the heart attack that had once stolen my breath. I had always known her intentions, had always sensed the venom coiled beneath her angelic smiles, but suspicion alone had been a fragile weapon. Now, at last, I held proof, not written on paper or whispered in rumor, but spoken directly from her own mouth. It was the confirmation of my darkest fear, and the realization sent a shiver down my bones. I did not move, not even when her footsteps clicked against the marble floor as she paced. My hands remained folded on the blanket, my breathing steady, while inside I felt as though the earth had tilted. Her voice shifted again, softer now, sweet enough for anyone passing by to think she was checking in with a friend. But I had already heard the truth, stripped of disguise, and that truth echoed louder than any tenderness she could feign. For the first time, I saw the shape of her plot with clarity. This was never about caring for me, never about waiting for inheritance in due course. She wanted me gone, erased, and she was willing to gamble everything to see it done. The realization brought no tears, only a steel resolve. Fear twisted in my chest, yes, but alongside it was a flame of defiance. If she believed her words would pass into nothing, if she thought I was too weak or too frail to catch them, she had underestimated me once again. I stopped pretending to be the fragile woman the doctors and visitors expected, and I began to record every odd detail with a pencil and a small leather notebook I kept beneath my pillow. Each morning I listed the names of nurses, the time of rounds, the pills I had been given, the exact phrasing of explanations that sounded rehearsed. I wrote down the times the phone rang and the tone of the calls, the visitors who lingered too long in the hallway, the registry numbers of crates I had been told were safe. At first it felt like a small rebellion, a private ledger to hold my memory steady, but the pages filled and a fire grew inside me. I asked Martin to discreetly reinstall the hidden cameras that had once watched the corridors and the service doors, cameras my daughter-in-law had ordered removed under the excuse of privacy. He did it at night with gloved hands, and a loyalty that trembled when he spoke, and when he finished, he left me the password written on a scrap of paper folded into the spine of my book. I also hired a private nurse, a woman with steady hands and an honesty in her voice that did not bow to the household politics. I put her payroll on my own personal account and signed her contract directly so that no one could claim control of her wages or threaten her livelihood. She arrived with a quiet competence and did not ask questions about reports or permissions. She arranged medicines according to the chart I requested. She logged visitors on a pad I could read, and she watched for the little irregularities that betrayed the larger scheme. Having her was like adding a second pair of eyes to my own slowly returning sight. Most important of all, I made a choice that felt dangerous and yet necessary. If they believed I was dying, they would lower their guard, they would become careless. So I let them have the image of frailty. I let the rumor of my decline spread while I moved in the shadows like a hunter. I thought of the words I would never say aloud, of the cold resolve coiling beneath my ribs. If they thought I would die in a few months, then this staged decline would become my weapon. The recordings began as flickers of movement on a screen, ordinary at first, but the more I watched, the more a pattern emerged. Ella was not careless. Her appointments were neatly arranged, spaced out so that no one would suspect. Yet the cameras showed her slipping into cars with deliberate precision, her face composed, her phone clutched like a shield. Cross-referencing those images with the notes Martin secured from the GPS logs of her driver, the truth came into sharp focus. The destinations were always the same: the museum, the law office, and the corporate headquarters. 3 different places, 3 different men, and all of them bound together by her duplicity. Late-night journeys traced on the maps matched the hours when Liam Brooks lingered at the museum, when Noah Harrison stayed behind in his office, when Logan Price claimed to work late. Each trip overlapped perfectly with their schedules, painting a picture too precise to be coincidence. I sat with the printouts spread before me, the ink still smelling faintly of the machine, and felt the cold weight of betrayal. She had woven herself into each of their worlds, playing the devoted confidant, the ambitious partner, the secret lover, all while building a net strong enough to strangle me and ensnare my son. The most damning evidence arrived almost by accident: a photograph, grainy but unmistakable, taken at a charity gala. Ella stood close to Liam, the museum director, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile more intimate than any wife should ever offer another man. Around them the wealthy sipped wine and clapped for pledges, but in that single frozen moment the mask slipped. It was not the act of a dutiful daughter-in-law, but of a woman drunk on power and desire. I stared at the image until my chest ached, then slipped it into the notebook where I had begun to build my case. Piece by piece, the puzzle assembled itself. She was not merely reckless, she was strategic. Each man gave her something the others could not. From Liam came access to the art world and the ability to disguise stolen paintings as loans. From Noah came forged authority and the labyrinth of offshore companies to hide transfers. From Logan came sabotage from within, his betrayal crippling Caleb's defenses and weakening the company's shield. Together they formed a triangle of corruption, with Ella at the center, pulling strings with the skill of a seasoned puppeteer. I closed the book slowly, my hands trembling not with fear but with fury sharpened into resolve. For the first time I no longer doubted, no longer hesitated. She was not a careless opportunist, she was a calculated predator. And now, with evidence in my grasp, I began to shape the counterattack that would one day unravel her empire of lies. Ella had perfected the art of division, and each man in her web believed himself chosen, irreplaceable. To Liam Brooks at the museum, she offered the golden key, the promise of my heritage collection. She spoke to him of exhibitions that would secure his name in academic journals, of fundraising galas that would elevate his institution beyond rivalries. She let him believe he was safeguarding culture, when in truth he was stealing it piece by piece. To Noah Harrison, the family lawyer who should have been my shield, she dangled power and profit. She whispered of exclusive authority over my medical proxy, of the quiet percentage he would pocket from offshore companies only he could set up. She bound him with secrecy, twisting his oath until he was too compromised ever to return. And to Logan Price, the deputy with ambition burning under his skin, she painted the future in bold colors. She leaned close and murmured that once the old woman was out of the way, They would control the empire together. Each man fed on promises, never realizing they were only one leg of her tripod. I knew I could not confront her with words alone. So I summoned an old ally, Mr. Keaton, a security technician who had once worked for my late husband. His hands were as steady as in the old days, his loyalty sharpened by memory of the man he had served. Together we disguised microphones within the house, each one hidden in plain sight, camouflaged as sockets and power outlets. Wires hummed silently behind the walls, and the air itself became my witness. The first test was simple. I asked Ella light-hearted questions, trivial things about dinner menus and charity events, then replayed the recording afterward. Every inflection, every sigh, even the brush of her sleeve against the chair came through with crystalline clarity. The system worked, and my heart steadied with a resolve I had not felt in months. From that day on, I feigned deafness, leaning forward as if I strained to catch her words. I let her believe her conversations were safe within these walls, that I was too frail to notice the sharpness in her voice when she took her calls. It took less than a week before the trap bore fruit. One afternoon, while she thought me dozing in the parlor, her voice slithered across the line to Noah. I heard her say with chilling calm that a new power of attorney must be signed before I was discharged. That time was running short. The phrase cut into me like a blade, confirmation that her schemes were racing against my recovery. Yet instead of despair, I felt something far stronger. I had proof, not suspicion, preserved in digital memory beyond her reach. I stored the files on an external drive kept in a drawer only I could lock, far from the reach of the household network, untouchable by the fingers that thought they ruled this house. Each file was a stone, and together they would become the fortress from which I would launch my counterattack. The discovery began with a single pill, a small blue capsule that never belonged among the others. Each day it had been placed in the plastic cup beside my bed. Each day I had raised the cup to my lips, but instinct told me to resist. I pretended to swallow while tucking one away, slipping it into the hollow of a jewelry box hidden in my drawer. Days passed until I had gathered enough, a secret cache of suspicion waiting for the right set of eyes. It was a young physician, assigned to the night shift, who finally uncovered the truth. I handed him one of the blue pills wrapped in tissue, my gaze steady though my hands trembled. He carried it to the small analysis unit down the hall and returned with a face drained of color. The active compound, he whispered, was not what the official chart prescribed. It was an anti-arrhythmic, not in the form meant to stabilize, but in a dose designed to unsettle the heart. A slow poison, crafted not to kill swiftly but to sabotage rhythm, a death disguised as natural decline. He went further, combing through the medication records. There, buried in the files, he found the supposed authorization. The signature glared at him in false confidence, but to trained eyes it faltered. The strokes lacked the sharp precision of the department head, the ink color mismatched, the slant unnatural. It was forgery, blatant yet cunning, as though someone believed the paperwork would never be questioned. He stared at me with eyes that held both fear and duty, knowing what such knowledge could cost him. When he placed the pill back into my hand, his voice dropped low, almost a breath. If you had swallowed this for 10 more days, your heart would have stopped, and no one would have doubted it. The words chilled me to the marrow. A few days later, when my health had improved, I attended a major museum press conference in the state. At first, the press conference at the museum felt like any other, filled with polite clapping and long speeches about art and culture. But when I flipped through the glossy catalog they handed out, my heart stopped. On page 11 I saw a painting I knew better than almost anything else in my home. The caption said it was a gift from an anonymous collector, but I couldn't be fooled. In the bottom right corner was the same uneven brushstroke my late husband once pointed out with pride, and the wooden frame had the small scar on the back that only he and I ever noticed. As soon as I returned home, I went straight to my study and opened the Art Loss Register, the international database that tracks insured works. I typed in the artist's name, the title, the size, and the serial number. The results were like ice in my chest. The original record still showed the painting as part of the Bennett family collection, fully insured and untouched. But another record, created just 2 months earlier, listed the same painting under a vague company name marked as on loan for exhibition. Two versions of the same painting existed on paper, and that could only mean one thing. My suspicion was finally confirmed. The real painting had been swapped out, funneled through the museum system as if it were a loan, while my home was left with a clever copy. What the public admired under bright lights was my legacy, stolen and disguised as a generous donation. I closed the file with shaking hands, anger rising in me like a storm. They thought the scheme was flawless, that no one would ever notice. But now I had seen behind the mask, and I would not forget. I wrote to my son every day, long messages filled with details of my health and small reminders of our shared life, but the replies never came. Instead, my inbox delivered the same cold notice again and again. Delivery delayed. The explanation suggested his mailbox was full, yet I knew it could not be true. Through public updates and corporate announcements, I saw him corresponding actively with partners in Europe, his words quoted in articles, his statements broadcast to investors. He was speaking to the world, just not to me. The phone offered no comfort either. Each time I dialed his number, the call slipped into voicemail before even a single ring. My voice poured out into the void, unanswered, unheard. Suspicion gnawed at me, so one afternoon I asked Martin to call using his own phone. The moment the line connected, my son answered, his voice bright, unaware of the silence that had been forced between us. The truth hit me like ice water. It was not distance keeping us apart. It was interference. I reached out to an old contact, a cybersecurity technician who once audited our systems. His analysis confirmed what my instincts already screamed. The IP address of the estate had been added to a blacklist within the company's communications servers. Any email, any call routed through our network was blocked before reaching Caleb. It was not a technical failure. It was deliberate. The digital wall had been raised by someone inside, someone with access and authority. The technician traced the changes to an account only one person could use, the deputy director, Logan Price. My son's trusted second-in-command and Ella's secret lover had sealed the channels between mother and son with a few keystrokes. The betrayal carried both cruelty and calculation. They wanted me isolated, unable to warn Caleb, unable to expose the cracks in the empire until it was too late. I closed the report with trembling hands, fury burning through my veins. They thought they had silenced me. But silence can be broken, and now I knew not only their intent but also their method. Logan had left fingerprints in the code, and one day those fingerprints would become his undoing. A late night found me at the window of the estate, the gardens a black hush beyond the glass, headphones heavy on my ears, the small speakers whispering betrayals back at me. I replayed the recordings until the edges of each sentence had been worn smooth by repetition, until the voices became a map I could read. Each confession, each casual instruction, each careless laugh assembled into a plan so precise it stopped being greed and became a machinery of destruction. For the first time, the shape of it was clear. It was legal, financial, medical, all woven together like a net meant to catch a falling body. I had thought at first that appetite had overtaken them, that pride and lust had led to bad choices. Now I understood that those impulses were harnessed, directed, and protected by men who knew how to turn law and money and hospital protocols into tools. The lawyer who had once counseled my husband, the doctor who charted my recovery, the manager who oversaw the vaults, any one of them could have been bought or threatened until compliance felt like survival. The breadth of it made my skin prickle, but it also sharpened my focus. Fear was there, but it sat beside something colder and more useful, resolve. I let myself smile then, a small bitter thing, because the thought came clear and bright. They wanted me dead, and I would let them believe I might die, but that feigned end would be my weapon. If they moved in on certainty, they would expose themselves. If they reached with greedy hands, they would leave fingerprints I could not only see but bring into court. The next morning, I placed a quiet call, not to the familiar, but to a lawyer who specialized in international art and asset recovery, and who had no prior dealings with our family. The meeting took place in a modest office near the center, under the harmless pretext of seeking advice on insurance for a collection. I walked in with copies of everything that had hollowed my life. There was the temporary medical power of attorney, the loan contracts with the museum, the altered medication orders and their forged approval. He read with the calm of a man who had seen many kinds of fraud, then looked up and explained the cleanest path forward. Prove a single signature is forged, he said, and the entire chain of transactions collapses. If one document that authorized transfers or loans is void, then subsequent sales and registrations have no legal foundation. That truth felt like a key turned in a heavy lock. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tide move. The recordings were not just proof. The files were not just memory. They were the beginnings of a case that could unmake what had been done. I gathered everything with careful hands: the insurance records, the international registry numbers, and the glossy photograph from the museum catalog that had nearly stopped my heart. Each document was a piece of the net they thought invisible, but now I turned it into a weapon. I opened a new Proton Mail account under a false name, bought a laptop in cash, and wrote a report detailed enough to show patterns without exposing myself. The email went directly to the FBI's art crime team, the division trained to follow stolen works across borders and to unravel the laundering schemes that hid fortunes behind canvas and paint. 48 hours later, the reply arrived. It was brief, clinical, and it made my pulse steady. They confirmed the case had been opened. They urged me to remain silent, to let no one suspect, for exposure would kill the chance of success. I closed the laptop and slipped it into the locked drawer of my study. My breath held for a long moment as I realized I was no longer alone in this fight. Then I set the bait. In a secondary safe, one I knew Ella checked whenever she could, I placed a false inventory. It listed the family's holdings but left gaps where several major paintings should have been. The handwriting looked official, the paper deliberately aged. I left the safe slightly ajar as though forgotten. Days later, I watched from the hidden cameras as she discovered it. Her face shifted in triumph as she snapped photos and hurried to call Liam, certain she had stumbled onto another opening to move stolen works. The camera caught every detail, from the angle of the phone in her hand to the glow of greed in her eyes. I leaned back in my chair as the feed played. The more desperate they grew, the more reckless they became. Every step Ella took to seize what was not hers tightened the noose, and now, for the first time, I felt the scales begin to tip, not in their favor but in mine. I began with the smallest spark, using a prepaid phone that could not be traced back to me. A short anonymous message slipped into Liam's inbox, suggesting that Noah, the family lawyer, had skimmed a quiet fortune from the Swiss painting deal. I chose my words carefully, just enough to ignite suspicion without proof, knowing greed and ego would do the rest. Then I turned to Noah. From a masked email, I attached a fabricated contract, its details altered to imply that Logan, the deputy director, had recorded every whispered conversation with Ella, preparing to betray him for leverage. Finally, I let Logan taste the poison of doubt. Through an insider tip planted in his ear, he learned Ella was negotiating with an international investment fund, her plan to replace him with a foreign CEO once the company was under her control. The effect was immediate. Liam, once smug and confident, grew restless, pressing his contacts in Switzerland for answers. Noah began scouring his inbox, demanding private meetings with Ella, his tone edged with paranoia. Logan, ever ambitious, now paced his office in anger, convinced he was being double-crossed. None of them realized the seeds had been planted by the same hand. Each believed himself too clever to be fooled, yet each one began to doubt not only Ella, but each other. In their confusion, truths began to slip. Liam hired a private investigator and soon learned Ella was not as exclusive as he thought. Noah, desperate to cover his tracks, confronted her in veiled threats that revealed his own complicity. Logan, blinded by jealousy, pushed harder, searching for the evidence that would keep him secure. Piece by piece, the walls they had built together began to crack. From my chair in the quiet of the estate, I listened to their unraveling through recordings and whispers carried back by loyal allies. Their coalition, once solid, now trembled on suspicion and fear. They had conspired to erase me, but now they turned their knives toward each other. And I knew this was only the beginning of their collapse. I entrusted Martin, my faithful steward, with the most critical task I had ever given. In the quiet hours before dawn, he copied every camera file, every suspicious contract, every forged prescription onto a heavy external drive. His hands shook, not from age but from the weight of what he knew, and together we sealed it. The drive was sent through a Swiss bank's secure deposit service, far beyond Ella's grasp, beyond the reach of anyone in her web. At the same time, Martin kept a smaller copy hidden in his personal safe, a secret reserve should disaster strike. With this, no hand could erase or tamper with the evidence again. I moved carefully, leaving no trace of haste. In a modest office downtown, I sat with a notary, sliding across new pages of my will. My voice was steady as I dictated that all indirect routes of inheritance through Ella were to be severed. The ink dried with finality, the document sealed with quiet authority. Then I instructed the creation of a fresh trust, ironclad in its wording, one that named Caleb alone as trustee and beneficiary. No proxy, no spouse, no loophole would bridge her way into his rights. The brilliance of the move was in its timing. Every fraudulent contract they had crafted now clashed against an updated legal record. Their signatures, their fabrications, became worthless paper with no root in the official chain of documents. I ensured every step was filmed, every notarization recorded, until the legal weight was unshakable. As I left the notary's office, I felt a calm unlike any I had known since the heart attack. It was not the calm of surrender, but of control regained. They had believed me helpless, surrounded by walls they had built. Yet now I held the keys, not only to my survival but to their ruin. 2 days after I thought the net was closing, the FBI called with news that knocked the air from my lungs. A rare painting had been found in the vault of an auction house in Geneva. The catalog and the shipping papers traced its path out of the United States as an academic loan, but the dates had been altered, the chain of custody fudged. This was no longer a family quarrel or a civil dispute. It had become an interstate crime, something that carried the full weight of federal law. I felt a cold clarity then, as if a light had been switched on in a dark room. From that moment, every step Ella took would be watched by men and women with badges and warrants, rather than polite questions and polite excuses. I also understood my vulnerabilities. My emails could be intercepted, my phone calls rerouted, my messages delayed or disappeared. The digital world had been turned against me, and any attempt to speak plainly might be read aloud to the very people who wanted me silenced. I needed a channel that could not be forged, traced, or edited. I thought back to the bright summer of my son's childhood on the lake, to the little code my son and I used to hide notes in plain sight. The idea came to me like a small, stubborn flame. I wrote a letter by hand, slow and deliberate. I did not mention contracts, bank accounts, or crimes. I wrote about ordinary things, about a pie I remembered baking, about a sound a boat made against a dock, about the small blue ribbon I once tied on his coat. On the surface, the letter read like a doting mother rambling, but the first letters of several lines spelled out a single word that had been our secret since childhood. I could not risk ordinary post, so I folded the page and handed it to an old friend who worked at the Italian embassy. He agreed to send it through diplomatic channels, a sealed pouch that would arrive to my son in Milan without passing through household servers or through Ella's phone. I watched the courier leave and waited with a mixture of fear and hope that felt almost obscene. When my son opened the letter, he paused, his face changing in a way no message from a patient mother ever could. He had recognized the cipher instantly, the private signage of a childhood pact, and in that pause I felt the distance between us shrink. He understood then that this was no minor complaint. He understood that I had placed a call for help in a way that could not be erased, and he began to see the woman he trusted with new edges and shadows. The night of the so-called signing had been staged with deliberate grandeur. The great hall of the Miami estate glowed beneath the chandelier, but the brightness only deepened the tension, every polished surface reflecting unease. At the table sat Ella, her poise practiced, and Noah, the family lawyer, his briefcase open to a neat stack of forged documents. The transfer of shares, stamped with counterfeit seals, lay waiting like bait. Noah leaned closer, his voice low and heavy. "Once you sign, full control of the company is yours." Ella's lips curved into a triumphant smile, her hand closing around the pen as though destiny itself had been delivered. Then the trap snapped shut. In the instant the pen's tip hovered above paper, the lights cut out with a sharp click, plunging the room into a breathless dark. A second later, the projector flared to life against the wall, flooding the space with sound and image. Ella's own voice filled the hall, cruel and unguarded. "If she lives a few more months, all of our plans will collapse." Gasps rippled through the staff standing nearby. The next recording rolled without pause, Noah's voice admitting he had built shell companies to funnel money into Cayman accounts. The air thickened with each revelation, then shifted again as Logan's words thundered from the speakers, bragging about sabotaging Milan contracts to keep Caleb stranded in Europe. By the time the last sentence faded, the room was no longer theirs. The double doors swung open with force. Agents in body armor swept inside, badges gleaming under the flickering light. Their leader spoke with crisp authority, reading aloud a federal warrant for search and seizure. Noah jumped to his feet, sputtering arguments, but the agent pressed the document before him, signed at the highest level, undeniable. The room stilled. Files were gathered, safes sealed, boxes labeled and carried out with ruthless efficiency. All eyes turned at last to Ella. Her complexion had drained to ash, the smile gone, the pen still frozen in her hand. Around her, the empire she thought she commanded was collapsing, and for the first time she seemed small against the weight of the law. The back door opened with a soft click, and an agent guided my son into the room. He looked exhausted, still wearing the creases of a red-eye flight from Milan, confusion written all over his face. Before he could ask a question, the projector lit up again, replaying the recordings. He stood frozen as Ella's voice filled the air, sharp and cruel, calling him nothing more than a legal shield and worse, a fool. The words struck him harder than any physical blow, and I saw the disbelief crumble into something darker. I met his eyes across the room. For years I had carried the pain of watching him defend her, blind to her schemes. But in that moment, I let him see the truth etched in my gaze. There was sorrow, yes, but also resolve, the kind that left no room for doubt. He turned toward Ella, searching for an explanation, but chaos cut him short. Her hands trembled as she poured water into a glass, her smile brittle as porcelain. Then, in the distraction, she slipped a clear vial from her sleeve and emptied its contents into the drink before placing it casually near me. She thought no one would notice, but above her, the hidden camera caught every movement, broadcasting it onto the wall in brutal clarity. Gasps erupted as the agents closed in. The glass was seized, a test strip dipped in. The result flashed almost instantly, poison, potent and undeniable. My son staggered back as if the air had turned poisonous itself. I leaned forward slightly, calm at last, and let my words cut the silence. "This trap you walked into on your own." The projection zoomed in on her shaking hand clutching the vial, the image blown large enough for every person to see. There was no room for excuses, no way to weave another lie. The actress who had played the perfect wife and dutiful daughter-in-law now stood unmasked, her face pale, her eyes wide with real panic. The false tears of years past were gone, and what remained was raw fear. The room exploded with voices, but the truth was already sealed in light and sound. Under the relentless questioning of the FBI, the house of cards collapsed. One by one, the three men who had once propped Ella up began to talk, their voices breaking under the weight of evidence. Liam, the museum director, admitted to switching paintings and falsifying provenance records. His words spilled quickly, desperate for leniency. Noah, the lawyer, went further, outlining the entire maze of shell companies he had constructed, confessing to forged powers of attorney and contracts. Finally, Logan, the deputy director, confessed to sabotaging the Milan deal, admitting he had deliberately stalled negotiations. Each man pointed the finger at Ella, painting her as the mastermind who had pulled their strings. The room rang with the sound of betrayal. My son, who had watched the woman he loved unravel before his eyes, finally broke. His voice cracked, his cry torn between rage and heartbreak. Why would you do this? His question hung in the air, unanswered, the echo cutting deeper than any accusation. Ella fell to her knees, her fingers clawing at the polished wood floor as if she could hold on to something solid. Her face twisted with despair, the mask of control shattered. When the agent stepped forward and snapped the cuffs around her wrists, she did not resist. The flash of red and blue lights from FBI vehicles poured through the windows, illuminating the grand estate in cold brilliance. Her charges were read aloud, each word a nail sealing her fate: conspiracy to commit murder, forgery of legal documents, international art trafficking. Servants stood frozen, some trembling, while neighbors and reporters crowded the gates, capturing every frame of her disgrace. The angelic daughter-in-law image died that night, replaced by the stark picture of a criminal dragged away. As investigators dug deeper, the picture grew even uglier. Records revealed that Ella had secretly maintained multiple gambling accounts in Macau and London. Her hidden debts had climbed into the tens of millions, covered through elaborate laundering schemes run by Noah's shell companies. FBI tracing showed dirty money siphoned from family accounts, funneled into international betting pools. When this truth was spoken aloud, Caleb's face went pale with fury. It was not only betrayal of love, but the plundering of his heritage. The empire she had nearly destroyed was not enough. She had drained it to feed her own ruin. The headlines spread across America like wildfire. Fashion heiress daughter-in-law snared by FBI in multi-million art scandal. The very magazines that once flaunted Ella's photos in glittering gowns now rushed to erase her from their archives. Friends who had once clung to her at galas and charity dinners cut ties overnight, their silence louder than condemnation. The charity foundation where she had smiled from every brochure released a statement, stripping her name from their honors list. The woman once praised as a flower of high society was now branded the symbol of betrayal and greed. Her accomplices fell just as swiftly. Liam, the museum director, was dismissed, his academic standing crushed despite receiving leniency for his cooperation. Noah, the family lawyer, lost his license to practice and faced additional charges for laundering funds through offshore accounts. Logan, the deputy director, was fired, banned from holding corporate office for 10 years. Together they became a cautionary tale, proof of the heavy price that came with corruption and ambition. What saved us was not chance, but foresight. The quiet legal changes I had made earlier rendered all fraudulent contracts null and void. Every forged document collapsed like brittle glass against the strength of notarized truth. The company, once hanging by a thread, was rescued from the brink. Shareholders steadied, partners reassured, and the storm that might have swallowed our legacy passed. The board of international directors sent me a letter, their words heavy with gratitude. They praised not only the survival of the business, but the strength shown in the face of betrayal. They promised to stand firm with the family moving forward. For the first time in months, I felt not only relief but pride. The company's reputation did more than endure. It rose stronger, rebranded in the public eye as the firm that had narrowly escaped a hostile takeover. We were not victims anymore. We were survivors, a family and a brand reborn through fire. He sank into a storm of guilt, the weight of betrayal pressing down until it almost crushed him. For days he said little, haunted by the knowledge that he had defended the very woman who tried to destroy us. But when he finally fell to his knees beside me, his hand clutching mine with desperate force, his words broke through the silence. I will never let you stand alone again. The pain in his voice was raw, but it carried a promise stronger than any vow. From that moment, he stood at my side in every boardroom, every meeting, determined to guard what had nearly been lost. His personal heartbreak hardened into resolve. What he had lost as a husband, he meant to redeem as a son. Together we faced the world not as victims, but as survivors. My heart was still fragile from the battles it had fought, yet I lifted my head high at the first press conference after the scandal. Before the cameras, I spoke clearly. Wealth is not just money, it is the honor of a generation. Those words settled into the room like stone, and the legacy that had been threatened was steadied again. The company remained intact, the family name unsullied. In the eyes of the public, I was no longer a silent matriarch but a symbol of endurance, of justice reclaimed. In the last interview, I looked directly into the lens, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut. Money can buy false love, but justice will take everything back. That line spread like wildfire online, shared as both warning and inspiration, yet victory carried its own shadows. One late afternoon, the old garden glowed in red light, and I sat with a cup of tea steaming in my hands. Justice had been served, but happiness felt distant. The memories of the ICU, of Ella's cold eyes, of my son's tortured grief lingered like wounds unhealed. I stared toward the horizon, whispering to myself, "Can my son forgive himself for trusting the wrong person?" It was a question without an answer. If you have ever witnessed betrayal within your own family, I invite you to share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters more than you think. Every experience, no matter how painful, carries a lesson that could give someone else the courage to rise again. When we speak out, we show others they are not alone in their struggle. Let this space become a circle of strength, where stories of loss can transform into stories of survival. Write your truth, and together we can turn betrayal into resilience and pain into power.